Welcome, everyone, to the My Life After podcast. In this show, we will meet with people that have had big life changes, whether planned or unplanned, talk about any challenges they've encountered, and how they've come out stronger on the other side. In today's episode, I speak with Amit, a corporate lawyer who left his well-paying job not once, but twice to pursue a lifelong desire to be an entrepreneur. Taking a risk when you're young and single is one thing, but taking risks without a paycheck when you have a family is an entirely different ballgame. We talk about what it takes to have this much faith in yourself and what Amit is doing to make that leap of faith easier for others. Do you have what it takes? Like the immortal George Michael used to say, you just gotta have faith. Sorry. So I went on your website, and one of the things that stood out to me was a quote that you said, which is, I quit my job as a corporate lawyer to become a founder while having a mortgage, 2 kids, and a looming recession. And that really hits you hard when you think a lot of people who are in our stage in life could be early to mid 30s or early to mid 40s, whatever it is. I'm late 40s now, but I'm still thinking I'm younger. Mm. What made you do this? A lot of people would think, hey, are you crazy? You have a family, you have bills, all of these things. What made you take the leap and become a founder after having a very comfortable and well-paying corporate lawyer job?
Yeah, great question. One that I've had to explain to my wife and my parents many times, right? And it's something I struggled with for a while, and this is actually the second time that I've taken the leap of faith to launch something of my own, right? And the first time I did it, I didn't have, a wife then, I didn't have kids then, I didn't have a mortgage then, but what I did have was the privilege of moving into my parents' basement to kind of mitigate a lot of that risk. I was younger, and that experience, it was a stressful experience. I launched a startup. The startup objectively went well, but I was, without a salary for 2.5 years. So eventually I did go back into law. And so before I made the decision the second time around, I really wanted to mitigate a lot of the risks and kind of shelter myself from some of the challenges that I had the first time around, right? And a lot of that came down to having a salary, right? So if you do look on my website, later in that quote, it says, the only reason I was able to take such a gamble is because I did have a salary from day one. So I've created a model that I think a lot of people like us would resonate with, right? People who are in that comfortable corporate life, who want to take that risk, but don't have the extreme risk appetite, right? Or the luxury to be able to, really put everything on the line, right? A lot of people do, empowered to them to be able to do it, but it's not unreasonable, for my parents and my wife and you to ask, are you crazy, right? Because, you work really hard to get to a station in life to build that base, and risking it all for something that isn't thought through or made with a risk-based lens, is unreasonable for a lot of people. So the salary was, that's the short answer to why I was able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you describe to us what it is that you're doing now?
Yeah. So I'm launching a venture fund, a pre-seed venture fund, with an investment thesis to back seasoned professionals for the sole purpose of a founder salary, right? So, people who were probably born to be founders, but when they made their career choices, they went down a safe path and now are stuck, right? Mortgages, kids, enhanced opportunity cost, whatever it may be, they just can't leave without that salary. So I write the first check to enable you to kind of take that leap in a risk mitigated way, so you have a distraction-free runway to really find your true passion.
How would how would somebody know that they have what it takes to be a founder? I mean, a lot of us will say, hey, this would be a great idea if somebody made this thing, or this would be a great way if somebody created a way to easily pay for something with Bitcoin, etc. Just making up an example. How do you, if you are a founder or you have what it takes to be a founder?
You know what? I don't think you ever know, right? Until you do it, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like if someone asked me, how did I know, I have what it takes or want to be a corporate lawyer, right? I didn't know when I made that decision. My parents were just like, hey, you know what, go down this professional path. I followed the cues, and then only when I was in my job, I understood what was required of me. Unfortunately, in startup world, there isn't that much structure, right? So, so there are things you can do beforehand, right, to kind of validate assumptions, to kind of, speak to potential customers, right, that, are feeling a problem that you want to solve, to make an educated guess on whether you think that problem is worth solving, but you're not going to really know until you actually do it, right? So the biggest, I guess, characteristic of someone doing that is um, the uncertainty tolerance, right? Having the confidence in yourself to be like, I'm just gonna put myself in a situation, and hopefully I have, the tools to figure out, whether I want to keep pursuing this or not. But if I don't, that's cool too, right? Because the worst case is that I go back
Hmm.
to my day
Hmm.
job, right?
Yeah. I know when we talked in the past, one of the areas of, I guess, one of the professional areas that you've identified in terms of traits and qualities are people from, say, banking and capital markets. I'm not saying that's the only one. Of course, there's tons. There's also people who haven't done anything who just innately are uh, entrepreneurial and have what it takes. But can you talk to me about, say, some of the people in your cohort that you've been running through your firm that specifically have a capital markets background? What are some of the traits that they have that make them kind of a good fit for the program that you run?
Yeah. So I think the biggest quality is strong founder problem fit, right? So whether it's capital markets or whether it's, legal tech, right?
Mm,
If you're if you were in a profession where you've been able to ideally experience it yourself, but a pain point that you've seen, right? That you have a unique lens on, you have an obsession to want to solve it, right? And you have a network that you can leverage to solve it faster than other people. I think that's a really, important attribute. With capital markets specifically, right? One thing I do like to see is, because if you're launching a venture scale business, right? Another attribute is fundraising aptitude, right? Like the ability to raise capital and be comfortable doing that, right?
mm,
And so one trend I have seen is that people who come from capital markets or corporate law or just corporate generally, they're kind of more cool with that, right? Because when they go to their, family and friends or angels or other people, it's kind of like, I'm presenting you this opportunity to come in very early at a very low price that I believe is going to be huge. So it's an opportunity for you. Whereas some other professions, I think they kind of see raising capital as a negative, that, oh, um, I know this is not an opportunity right now because I'm still figuring it out. So I don't feel comfortable going to my family and friends or even angels to ask money at this stage because it feels like I'm asking for like a handout or something, right? When the former, perspective, I think will drive you a lot further, in this game. Not to say that, the person who's non-capital markets can't learn that, and they probably will after kind of running the motions and doing a couple pitches, and then eventually they'll come to a point where they truly believe that it's an amazing opportunity, right? And once they come to that point, then it will be natural. It's just really hard to do in the very early stages.
Okay. Okay. Are there any really cool business ideas that you've seen in the last little while? It doesn't have to be any ideas that you're incubating through your program, but just in general, what's a good pulse and trends of things that are out there that you're seeing in the last few months that maybe we didn't see a few years ago?
Well, the biggest, is obviously generative AI, right?
Mm,
That like everyone is doing something there. It's clearly, a wave, right? Like mobile, right? Every startup is going to have some touch point with AI. Um, and so the stage that I invest is like very early, right? So I actually try to stay away from the idea and focus more on the founder themselves, right? Because I used to before focus on the idea itself, but then when I did it myself, and now that I have an experience, you realize that it's iterating significantly to the point where many will probably pivot after doing it long enough. But really, the constant is the founder, right? So as long as there's a founder that I'm excited about and then think is a cool founder, right? And again has um, strong founder market fit, that's kind of what excites me, right? And probably more than the fit is the obsession, right? Because like really, it's a grind and it's a long term grind, right?
hmm
It's going to be the hardest thing, that you know someone ever does is launching a successful startup, and you're looking at like a 7-10 year window, right? It's not like a typical job where, if you hit a certain point, you're like, you know what, let me shift elsewhere, right? And you have the flexibility. Whereas here, it's kind of like all or nothing, right? You're trying to get to that exit. Sure, at some stage you can start taking a salary, and in some cases you can take secondaries, meaning at a financing round you can pull out some capital. But for the most part, like your investors and all your stakeholders have rallied around you for the long run, right? So finding someone who truly is obsessed to solve something, right, is the type of person who's going to stick around till the end. So seeing someone, and one specific example is there's a guy in our program. He, without kind of giving too many details, but used to work at some brand name places, was a CTO, um, used to have a very, 500K USD plus salary, but still left to be a founder, right?
Mm,
Um, reason he did is that he used to oversee a lot of junior developers, right? Who used to basically spend a lot of time doing, in their world, grunt work, right? Which is doing like, patches when big enterprises use all these APIs. And so he wanted to create and is trying to create basically an AI powered junior developer, right? That can do a lot of the work that his juniors used to do. So now their time can be freed up to do more creative and value creation work, right? So I think that's a perfect example of something cool, but also great founder market fit and an obsession to solve something that you've kind of painfully experienced yourself many times.
yeah, and that's on a great kind of trajectory in the sense that I think that seems to be the sweet spot right now for AI and machine learning. A lot of people, you're right, a lot of people and a lot of companies are talking about AI and machine learning, and some actually are doing it, some are just using it as marketing, and it's all smoke and mirrors. But in terms of how we talk about AI and how everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people are afraid of it taking away jobs. But really, what it can do is enhance existing roles, remove redundancies and manual tasks. One example I heard about was to say, hey, and this is just an example, but if I am a trying to build a house and I know nothing about building a house. I'm not a carpenter, I'm not a plumber or electrician, nothing. And I want to use a tool like AI to build a house. Just say AI could, right? That's a big gap between what AI can do and what I personally can do. But if you were to take a um, somebody who is a contractor, but not an engineer, but a contractor, and now there's a gap between what an engineer does in terms of designing a home, structural rigidity, all the safety things, etc., versus the tangible work that a contractor can do. You know, AI could bridge that gap a bit more and narrow that gap a bit more by, facilitating some of the design process that a contractor can do, um, and what an engineer does, and accelerate that a bit more. Another gap or another example is in nursing, right? Between the gap between what a nurse does and what a doctor does in terms of diagnosing a patient or treating a patient, and post care, AI and machine learning can recommend certain things in terms of what a nurse can do to enhance their role and close that gap between what a doctor does so that the doctor can focus on some of the larger high priority things. In Ontario, we have long wait lists for surgeries and treatment. And so that's how we need to, I guess, look at AI. So that's a great idea in terms of some of the junior developer roles and QA and things like that, right? So no, that's excellent. I know before and during the pandemic, the whole VC world and private equity world was flush with cash, and there were startups coming up left, right, and center, and it was quite easy for a lot of businesses and startups and fintechs to get funding for their ventures. Then the pandemic ended, reality set in, and valuations changed for a lot of these businesses. And a lot of the VCs and private equity firms were a lot more critical in terms of how they deployed their money, or how they call it dry powder in the industry. What does the market look like now? It's been some time since we've passed the pandemic. It's been some time since the valuations have consolidated. What does the market look like now, and how easy is it for startups to get funding?
So, unfortunately, it's still pretty tough, right? The ZERP era, the
What's ZERP? Uh,
zero interest rate phenomenon, right? Yeah, like people were throwing around money, right? Valuations were kind of crazy. Um, but like arguably, the silver lining is, you know, maybe you shouldn't be, investing just in hype, right? A lot of VCs were incentivized to kind of raise bigger funds and deploy bigger checks because you also get paid management fees, right? So I think now, um, from what I'm seeing, there definitely has been a shift, right? The before, one of your biggest criteria were growth, right? Now it is more, you know, legitimate revenue generating businesses, unit economics, like a path to a real business. You still need venture scale, right? But it's becoming more reasonable now, which honestly I think is a good thing, right? Um, there are still many crazy deals, right? Like generative AI, you still see huge things happening there. Serial founders, right, are still getting, a lot of backing very early on, at valuations, that the rest of the world are not getting, right?
okay.
But so a bit of it's still happening. Will it change? I don't know, right? Like VC does work on power law, right? Power law distribution, meaning, your the success of your entire portfolio is predicated on, a few handful of winners, right? So you need to take, risky bets and big bets on companies that have unicorn potential, right? So so there will always be, a lot of big capital being thrown on, certain deals. But yeah, I don't know if it'll ever get back to what it was in, a few years ago.
Okay. You mentioned earlier you, this is the second time that you left law and you pursued uh, being a founder. What is it do you attribute to personally that makes you take this leap? There must be something in you
Yeah.
that's whether you're a fighter, whether you're relentless pursuit of doing your own thing. What do you attribute your own personal traits that make you want to do this?
Uh, you know, so I think I was always born to be an entrepreneur, right? I come from an entrepreneurial family. My dad started his own business,
What was
and
the business?
so he had a few, but his last one, we used to export recycled goods
Okay.
to third world countries, right? So we had a factory here, and so just kind of seeing him and aspiring to do things, you know, um, that were kind of something that you wanted to solve, and you were, um, you know, constructing a path to kind of get to a destination and solving problems along the way was always pretty attractive to me. Um, but that's not to say I didn't like law, right? I used to be at a bank, right, in the capital markets group there, and then even before that, I was in the corporate group of a big law firm. And when I was practicing, like I enjoyed my life, right? I enjoyed my life. I enjoyed closing deals, but I would see some people around me and the level of excitement that they would have to certain information or certain things. I just didn't have it. Do you know what I mean? Right. And I would have that feeling of excitement when I would be talking to a friend and they're like, "Oh, what about this idea?" Or like when I watch The Social Network, right? And so I'd always be thinking of side hustles and things like that. And when I took the leap for the first time, right, even though it didn't have the outcome that I wanted to, I learned so much along the way, and I still had many small wins that gave me, those dopamine hits that I honestly never had in my day job, right?
Hmm.
And it could be something small, right? Like closing a deal, closing an investor, right? Getting that email on a Sunday where in my old role I'd be like, oh man, why is someone bothering me on a Sunday? I have to check it out of obligation. But when you do your own thing, you're like waiting for that email. You're like, thank God it came so I can absorb it, without a busy day and think about how to respond to it on, maybe later on Sunday, right? So yeah, those feelings, once you kind of have them, right? Even when I went back to my, so what I did is I left law when I was at a bank, right? And I actually went back to the same bank afterwards. And I went worked at my same boss, and he said, "Hey," he goes, "I know you're an entrepreneur, and I know you're gonna leave again. He's like, just do me a favor." And he's like, "Stick around just for a little bit, just so we get some value out of you being back, and you get to stabilize." And someone else in the same group said, "If you find something entrepreneurial in here, um, consider that as well, right? And we can
Hmm.
kind of help you go down that path." And I really appreciated that, right?
Yeah, that's a
And
good boss.
yeah, it's a great boss, great team, and one thing I'll say that because sometimes I come across founders who are like, "Oh man, I hate my job and I'm just on autopilot," and there's a saying going now, quietly quitting, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so the thing is that right now in my new venture, right, my old contacts have been like instrumental in what I'm doing, right? And it's because I build goodwill with them, and they know that, I'm leaving to pursue something. And when I was with them, I gave it my best, right? That they want to see me win, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think, I think wherever you are, you should really try to find out, where you want to be, but still give it your best, right? Because, relationships matter everywhere, right? And especially if you're trying to solve a problem in your space, those same people, your bosses, your colleagues, are going to play a role in that because they probably feel the same problem as well, right? So that's just something to keep in mind if anyone watching this is kind of contemplating that leap.
Yeah, definitely. How important would you say it is to for somebody who's a founder not be afraid to fail? And the reason I ask that is in the military they have this saying, some platoons or some groups have this saying, when you go into battle and if you accept the fact that you might die, that takes away your fear, right? It is just absorbed as the cost of doing business, so to speak, right? And once you get over that fear, then you can think clearly. Versus you go into battle and you're like, oh man, I'm afraid to take any shots because I might get hit and I might die, right? For a founder, how important it is to realize that or have that attribute of not being afraid to fail, being able to take risks. How important is that?
Honestly, hugely important. If you asked me this when I took my first leap and I just left, I'd give you a different answer because
Mm,
I used to go to a lot of events and I used to hate hearing people say it's okay to fail, right?
hmm
And saying,
hmm
oh, I failed this many times. And my gut reaction was like, well, if you had prepared properly, right, you shouldn't put yourself in a position to fail that many times. And in corporate, we come from a world where, your work product, like every T's got to be crossed, I's be dotted before anyone sees it. But that's really the wrong way of looking at it in startup world, right?
hmm
Um, the first time I really embraced it is when someone told me that it's okay to fail so long as you fail fast and cheap, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you reorient your view to don't look at it as a failure, but as an experiment, right? That you are looking to see if it's going to go one way or the other, and you get value both ways, right? Because and if I take it back to the same example of the work product crossing your T's and dotting your I's, in startup world, like if you're happy with your first version of your work product, you're probably already too late, right? Because because you don't know what to build until someone gives you that feedback, right? So you
Yeah.
kind of want to just get something out there, get feedback, iterate, do it again, do it again, do it again, and then eventually it's a place that you like, right? So that mindset I didn't have until probably like a good 6 months to a year the first time I did it, right?
hmm Okay.
You know, and sorry, and this kind of loops back to another one of your earlier questions, like what traits are important. So embracing failure is one. Another is coachability, right? I find people that I'm targeting, right, seasoned professionals, are very smart people in their world, right? And sometimes, they think they're right. And in many cases, they're logical, right? But you don't appreciate that sometimes customers aren't logical, right? And
Right.
and yeah, and even though you think it's the most, right way to do something, startup world is so different. So being able to kind of take feedback from people who you think aren't as smart as you, right? That's also a big trait, and then being fluid, because like even I myself was humbled, right? The first time around, I thought I was very smart, and that's why it took me 6 months to really to embrace the failure and the feedback and start asking the right questions, right?
Yeah. I think the failure is not an option thing is very much an age thing as well, right? When you're younger, you've had less experience, you've been through less battles, personally, professionally, and realize that you can't win them all. You just have to win the right ones. You have to pick, literally, you got to pick your battles, right?
Mm.
In the last, I guess for this journey, second time around, what have been your toughest moments personally?
Um, so so honestly, it hasn't been that tough, right? This time around, because I positioned myself in a way to kind of remove some of those, issues, right? And I'll tell you, like, my productivity has been 10x what it was the first time around, right? Because, having that salary.
Awesome.
Um, but but like, of course there are challenges, right? Because as a emerging manager, I'm basically a startup founder, so I'm also trying to raise capital in this very difficult fundraising climate, right? At the
Hmm.
same time, trying to deploy capital, right? So it's been a chicken and the egg, right? And it's taken a lot longer than I had hoped, right? But really, that's part of the game. And I think my second time around, I've become a lot more comfortable with uncertainty, right? And with, hey, eventually I'll figure it out, right? And as long as you have that mindset, I think it helps, you move and progress, right? So, yeah, so far things, I'm happy with the outcome so far.
Okay, that's great. That's great. I mean, I was going to ask you what have been some of the more rewarding moments as well in this journey. Have there been any any of the businesses that have taken the next step going through your program, and is there any that you could talk about?
Yeah. So interestingly, I myself had a pretty big pivot, right, in my model, right? So,
Mm,
and honestly, it definitely was a blessing, right? I'm solving the same problem, right? But I found a much more efficient and scalable way to do that, right? And also leveraging financial institutions in the process. And so, that's where a lot of my old contacts kind of really came into play, right? And reason why I made that earlier comment, how they were instrumental. And so, so there have been rewarding moments for sure along the way, but I none that have gone through my original model because of that pivot. I actually had to go back to the ones that I, had made a commitment to back and actually say, hey, there's been this pivot, and one of them was like, man, this is much better. And if you had spoken to me about this earlier, um, um, and before I left my job, I probably would have invested, right? And I get it. And so, that's why, like, the value of the relationship is so good too, right? So, so in terms of wins, just the small wins along the way, that's what kind of keeps me motivated.
and I guess what you were also referring to in your example there is a more robust financial backing backed by a financial institution for the in addition to yourself for people going through your program, right? Just in terms of the salary and being able to pay themselves and things like that.
Yeah, you know what? A bit more as well. I don't remember the last time we spoke, um, but so my model has changed such that financial institutions are actually integrated into the model, right?
Okay.
So, so I'm creating a VC model that I'm almost positioning like the student debt equivalent for founders.
It's like an
So,
MBA loan essentially, right?
yeah, right. So imagine a world where, and this is preliminary. I don't know when this podcast will be, distributed, but here's the vision, right? Imagine a world where you can walk into your local bank branch and get venture capital financing the same way that you get student debt,
Okay.
right?
That's pretty cool. That is
So
pretty cool. And probably have an uptick in that as the central bank cuts rates closer to the end of the year. At least here in Canada, we're still holding our breath for the U.S. So that's great. Um, I have two more questions for you before we close out. What what does the next 3 years look like for you? What in your ideal world, what's happening in the next 3 years, both personal perspective, from the perspective of the ecosystem that you've created at R6 Ventures, and also from a market perspective in terms of the industry and things. If everything were to align, what does that look like?
yeah, so from my perspective, um, I want to be in a position to deploy lots of capital very quickly, right? And I want to really, through this new model, just give anyone a fair opportunity at entrepreneurship, right? Um, and that's really the goal, right? Like the same way that student debt empowered, any student to pursue higher education. I want to empower, any professional to take a real shot at entrepreneurship, right? Without risking their house and without risking their family and relationships, right? So in the next 3 years, I would love to back like hundreds of founders, right? And the model that I was talking about, if things work out how I'm envisioning, and working with some strong FI partners, I should be able to do that at scale, right? So that's both the short term and the long term dream.
Okay,
Yeah,
awesome. And then from an industry perspective, what do you see happening? Is AI increasing? Are there other things that we're not thinking about? I mean, everybody talks about cryptocurrency, but more so the technology behind it in terms of ledger based post trade settlements and things like that. Um, anything that you see from any of those trends?
yeah. So with blockchain, I do think at some point there will be strong utility, for it. I think with AI though, I think it's going to touch everybody, right? Being being a former corporate lawyer, I always come across many people in my old world asking me about, how prevalent AI will be in that industry, because legal services was one that many experts said was very susceptible to the technologies coming out, and that's largely because a lot of it, especially corporate law, and sorry, even litigation, a lot of it is in text, right? But like me as a corporate lawyer, like we charge hundreds per hour to review a 100-page document, and sometimes just doing basic changes to that would take like 10 hours to do, right? AI will be able to, not will be able to, can now spit out documents very quickly. Initial drafts you can do super quick now. You can do reviews, against your templates super quick. So what I tell some of those lawyers who are scared of their jobs is that I don't think AI will ever replace the lawyer, but lawyers who know AI will replace those who don't, right?
Yeah,
So, yeah, so I think the big shift you're going to see is a lot of the workforce becoming much more competent in AI and other tools, right, to facilitate work in a more efficient way.
I think, and there was another lawyer that's going to be on another episode I recorded this past weekend. And one of the things we talked about, though it didn't impact her, was just in the last few years, there's been a lot of lawyer burnout for lawyers, right? And maybe AI provides that buffer to take some of the load off of them, right? I mean, the amount of time doing research and reading and going through various documents, etc. maybe that's the delta, maybe that's the game changer, right? Is those mundane tasks of, I would think in, for example, using corporate law, right? There's some agreements that are out of date. Maybe AI can suggest, hey, these are the ones that are now should be updated to more modern methodologies for certain things, etc. So yeah, no, it's exciting. Definitely, it is something that, I mean, it's already probably in our in our daily things that we use, whether it's an app for Starbucks or McDonald's, etc. Right? It's suggesting, it knows it's hot. It's suggesting a particular cold drink for us to get, etc. And one of the things that a lot of the apps are doing is isolating customers, right? So we no longer go in, for example, if we're on an app, if you and I walk into a McDonald's that you can order from your phone or from the screen or from the person, if I order from my phone, I may not know that there's a special on cheeseburgers, but I'm ordering on my phone. It knows I'll pay whatever I want, or because I'm in a rush, and it'll charge me full price, but it knows that you don't like cheeseburgers as much. It may offer you half off, etc. Right? So that's another thing that's also happening a lot, and AI is a big part of that as well. The last question I have was, so I'm doing something, I'm completely copying it from another podcast that I follow, but the last question was left by the previous person that I interviewed, and I'm going to ask you as well. You don't have to do it for me today, but send me a question for the next guest. So my previous guest asked the question of, have you ever had times where you felt like you were in doubt of doing this, of taking this leap this time around? Have you ever had times of doubt, and how'd you deal with it?
Good question. Yeah. Um, so what I actually did, because everyone has doubts at certain points, right?
Of course.
What I did is, and I probably will ask some of my founders to do this as well, but when I left my old role, right, and not speaking ill about the role, as I mentioned, I enjoyed my time there, but everyone has, certain moments at that role that you're like, oh man, this sucks, right? So, what I actually did is I wrote down a few points, right, of specific facts and instances that occurred in my old role where I just read them again and I'm like, oh man, regardless of what my challenge is today, right, those moments were worse, right?
Mm, mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's not about being happy all the time, right? It's about relative happiness, right? And like what's my alternative, right? That those points are part of my alternative, right? So rereading those kind of makes me feel grateful to be where I am, and I say, damn, I don't want to be in that situation again, right? So it's all good. And
Yeah.
and when you feel grateful and it's all good, your productivity goes up as well, right? So it works for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to what you said earlier as well, I think at the end of the day, it's the personal side of it, is it's the value we place on certain things, right? And some people get very excited about closing a particular deal or a contract, but if you were to quantify that dopamine hit, you could say, hey, that, if you want to say that's 450 units, I'm just making this number up, right?
Mhm.
But that 450 units happens to you when, yes, you get a client on board. You're one of the people going through your program signs their 10th client, and this one is the one that will now take this to the next level. And now you're seeing the growth, and that's the that's one of the things about being comfortable with uncertainty, is uncertainty can have tremendous upside, can have tremendous downside, but it also has tremendous upside. Of course, we're all working towards that at the end of the day, but it comes down to the value we place on things. So that's great. Amit, This was great. Thank you very much for joining me. It was great to catch up with you. I enjoyed our conversation for a lot of reasons, but I could see why you are doing this. I could see you being very successful. I know your work ethic and how strong it is, and I know that people that you've worked with, myself included, think very highly of you. So I'm really excited for you. I'm glad you did this, and looking forward to keeping in touch with the journey as I'm going to do with a lot of my guests. It is a journey, and it would be great to chat in a year's time to say,
Hmm.
hey, this is where we're at. This is the trajectory, and it's beyond what we expected, and it's great. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate the kind words, and thank you for having me on this. And truly look forward to that next episode with a lot of exciting updates, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Entrepreneurship is not for the faint of heart. Not many people have the guts to do it, but those that do and get through the fog of uncertainty with tenacity, product fit, and timing of the market will reap the rewards. Remember, every overnight success has been 10 years in the making. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next time. This podcast was brought to you by Heal3, a holistic, curated, and affordable employee well-being solution.